They're all combat-centric. Anything in heavy armor or in power armor is combat-centric. You don't send a guy out in power armor to negotiate a truce.
There was still a need for some uncivilized ones. Not every one of the Emperor's wars would be against human civilizations destined to be part of the glorious Imperium. There were also enemies that could not be reasoned with or ever incorporated. Human civilizations who had fallen too far. The many Xenos horrors the galaxy held. Populations so rebellious that only inhuman brutality would cow them. And the Emperor seems to have created a number of legions for exactly that purpose. To sow terror, to fire into nests of Xenos or twisted humans unsupported, or to descend like a horde on the foe and leave nothing but ruin. And I've put these legions into another category. Terror weapons. The first and most obvious of these is the 8th Legion, who would later become known as the Night Lords, though there wasn't really much of a change when that happened. The early 8th Legion drew their recruits from the lightless prison sinks of old terror, the pale children of people condemned in centuries past, growing up in the bloody depths and surviving as savage killers. The first recruits of the Legion were noted to have this tendency towards moral absolutism and a drive to enact retribution, and we can assume that was intentional because Comrade Kurz on faraway Nostromo was exactly the same. And that intention is further reinforced by the fact that the Emperor used them like that, as a weapon of punishment. The early 8th Legion were deployed against rebels, populations who broke the Emperor's laws, societies guilty of some great breach of the Lex Imperia. They were, from the very, very start, a terror weapon, a threat, something deployed as an example to bring brutal and merciless justice to those who wouldn't comprehend.
A terror weapon, a threat? Aren't they all? Like, if you send any one of these guys, hold on, where's that table he was making? To a rebel planet, wouldn't that be the point? Huh. I'm guessing there's not much of a line when they all look the same. It's just that we've been at this for like 20 minutes now, and I have yet to actually hear sufficient distinction that would, separate one legion from another. Because they were literally cut in half versus, traitor and loyalist legions. But you know what? In terms of functionality, they're all the same. It just so happens now that the blueberries are getting their time in the sun due to, recent developments from Titus and to, the 500 Worlds announcement. So,
any other way. Even at the start of the Crusade, many in the Imperium thought they were a bad idea. Maybe a legion designed to build an empire, but not one suited to living in it. And this would, of course, accelerate with the discovery of Curzon.
Isn't that the point? I mean, when King Arthur built the Knights of the Round Table, you had to disband an army. But, from the first book alone, from Horus Rising, what was the name of that Imperial Fist? Guy, he said, no, this war will never end. Right? We might conquer it all, but guess what? Our jobs would never be over, that we have to police it.
Nostramo. In the end, it was Nostramo that would damn them. As the Great Crusade became more successful, it had less need of terror weapons, but at the same time, the Legion had slowly been filled with the most brutal murderers and criminals from their home planets. So while the Imperium wanted them to tone it down, the Night Lords were getting more and more sadistic, to the point where they were basically rebels before the heresy even started. But in terms of the intention from the outset, it seems that at first, the role of the Night Lords as the Emperor's great threat was one that he definitely intended them to have from the very, very start. The second Legion in this, though, is less obvious. The 6th Legion, the one that would eventually become known as the Space Wolves. These are the second of the Trefoil Legions, created in secret and kept separate from the others, but this was likely because of the Canis Helix, a sort of experimental genetic primer to their gene seed implantation, which gave them heightened senses and increased aggression. That was combined with a recruitment policy that saw them drawing from only the most regressive and hyper-violent cultures they could possibly find. And while they were held back at first, when they were deployed about a decade into the Crusade, the results were shocking. The Legion were committed to the capital of a world called Delvsan, and while at first it looked like they were doing a Lunar Wolves-style shock assault, what transpired was more like the savagery of a swarm of animals. The 6th Legion flowed through the streets of Massanorkor like a flood, sweeping over the defenders and tearing them apart. Absolutely no quarter given, holding no ground, just murdering and ripping apart everything they found, lost into the violence, never reined in by their commanders, and continuing the slaughter until the world eventually surrendered, which is tactics quite reminiscent of the 8th Legion.
Mhm.
Imperial observers were horrified by this slaughter, comparing them to a pack of animals rather than an ordered army.
That they
And
are.
the 6th Legion continued like that through the early years of the Crusade, used for hunter-killer operations or as a brutal, bloody reprisal force let loose against rebellions. Other armies that fought alongside them were horrified by what they did, but it seems clear that this was exactly what the Emperor intended. He nurtured them for a long time before letting them loose, and he mostly ignored their savagery and all the complaints from Imperial High Command. However, they were reunited with their gene-sire, Leman Russ, on
There we
Fenris
go.
quite early in, and while they retained a lot of that previous savagery, Russ seems to have managed to parlay this into a reputation as the Emperor's loyal executioners, honourable warriors who are just willing to do what needs to be done, though there's no actual evidence that that was a title given to him by the Emperor. By the end of the Crusade, that is how
I mean, if you look like that and you're backed by guys like this, you don't need anyone else to give you a title, alright? You just take it.
everyone's referring to them. But it's worth noting that one of the most prominent advocates of this idea that every Primarch had a specific job were the Space Wolves. They use that theory to justify their role. I'd suggest that when the 6th were created, the Emperor seemed pretty happy to just have another terror weapon, just one a bit more bestial and less calculated than the 8th Legion, but still a horde that destroyed whatever they were set loose against. The genius of Russ was maybe finding a palatable presentation for this aggression, something Conrad Kurz was completely unwilling to do. And while we're on the subject of legions who were maybe saved by their Primarch, the 9th Legion were another of the more uncivilized weapons in the Emperor's arsenal. The legion that would become the Blood Angels were originally known as the Revenant Legion, and due to some unique gene seed quirks, they were to become another of the more horrific weapons at the Emperor's side. The gene seed of the 9th was unique in that it worked on pretty much anything. The most debased mutant could be implanted and their bodies and minds totally transformed into a warrior of the 9th. But their gene seed also had another quirk, an overactive omophagia gland that caused its warriors to hunger for the blood and flesh of their enemies, or their own legion. They didn't really mind. The legion quickly became completely unsuited to any joint operation, hated by any that they fought alongside. They were described like ghosts that haunted the edge of the Imperial advance, the stench of death and madness surrounding them, their ranks filled with charnel cults, and they became deployed
Charnel cults.
almost as a
I mean, not surprising at all, yet for some reason. Hold on. Hold on. This is Sanguinius band, right? Am I right? This is Sanguinius, these are Sanguinius' kids. Yet he was Sanguinius was beloved by all. Wonder what happened to them.
fire and forget weapon against isolated enclaves of mutants and aliens. Lost to their own blood madness, the Legion would engage in a frenzied assault, slaughtering their way through the enemy until their bloodlust was sated, their losses replaced by whatever stunted dregs of humanity they could find on the planets they were assigned to. The campaigns had such a high rate of attrition that it was common for their line officers to consume the brains of their dead superiors, which was the only way of keeping any command experience around for a long period of time. It was Sanguinius, a vastly more noble being than maybe anyone expected, who would turn this around.
Alright. So just like Lehman, he sort of rehabilitated this particular legion. Alright, got it. Understood now. Because we are looking at a very beloved figure right now.
their worst excesses and provide them with enough purpose that they would eventually become some of the most vaunted and glorious warriors of the Imperium, eventually seeing the need to restrain their worst impulses as a noble pursuit. Like
he was like the Justin Bieber, early 2Ks Justin Bieber. Of among all of Big East children, he was their Justin Bieber. He was the poster boy, he was the boy next door, he was the blonde hair with the soft voice.
Like the Space Wolves, their Primarch,
and that makes Big E P Diddy,
taught them self-control.
Not sure how to feel about it.
But it seems clear that this was at the initiative of Sanguinius. The Emperor was absolutely fine just having another terror weapon to go alongside his murderers and his attack dogs.
Of course he
and then
was.
Finally in this section, we have another later Loyalist Legion, the 19th. The early 19th shared many of the preferences of the later Raven Guard they would become, but they were aimed in a very different direction. The 19th were recruited from the Xeric tribes of the Asiatic Dustfields, and they quickly evolved a specific way in which they liked to operate during the Unification Wars. The 19th would be deployed by the Emperor against enemies who have refused his call for unity, with the intention basically of humiliating them. Rather than arraying themselves for any traditional war, the 19th would deploy in small hidden bands across the region before rising up as one, striking from the least anticipated quarter and decapitating the enemy with shocking violence, before then enslaving the terrified population as a punishment. The warriors of the Legion were noted for their ruthlessness and their cruelty, possessing a cold, clinical nature and a skill for identifying and exploiting an enemy's weakness. Assassins, murderers, deployed to exact retribution on those who had defied him. In fact, in many ways, again, their job was a lot like that of the 8th Legion, except their tactics focused on subjugation rather than just visible punishment. Korax is interesting partly because of how different he was from that template. Since he grew up in a prison colony, he despised the slavers that comprised his legion, and he eventually exiled most of them, replacing them with aspirants from his homeworld. Like the Blood Angels and the Space Wolves, he would very much rebrand his legion into freedom fighters, but it's telling that one of the very first things the Emperor did when he was reunited with the Primarch was to stand back and watch to see if Korax was willing to nuke his own planet, to see if he had the ruthlessness the Emperor felt the Crusade demanded. So, I think these 4 legions have a very
definitely some P. Diddy behavior. Nuking your own planet.
Specific role. They are the terror weapons of the Imperium, not the just conquering armies of a glorious empire, but tools to be used against foes that needed complete extermination or intimidation.
Those that needed spanking.
To form compliance. At least that's how they seem when we take away their Primarch's homeworld and culture. All 4 of these legions were deployed into the Crusade with what seems like great intention assigned to very specific wars by the Emperor because of methods they had used since the very start of their existence. In the end, 3 would be redeemed in various ways by their Primarchs who grew up in much more noble environments or sought to save them from themselves, and other different legions would fall into savagery. But at the start of the Crusade, I would suggest that these are the ones intended as brutal terror weapons, as a counter to the more traditional military forces of those battle line legions. Next up, we have 4 legions that I'm going to describe as specialists. These are legions who also fought on the front lines, but they seem to have been given a really specific role from the Emperor early on in their career, a role that wasn't just be a terror weapon. Many of these are quite quick to figure out, since it's very, very clear what their job was from the start, and their Primarch is usually exactly the same. We'll start with...
But question is, can we actually, is there like literally a huge distinction between one or the other? Because each and every one of these legion can deliver. They choose, of course they can choose not to, but they can deliver sheer terror to any population.
The simplest one here, the 3rd Legion. The 3rd seems to have been destined for glory since the beginning. They were recruited from the sons of Terran aristocracy, and from the start it was noted that their legionnaires had a refined bearing, an aesthetic sense that led to a glorious appearance, and a skill in inspiring other troops, often being placed in command of Imperial army formations. The political sense of that is quite clear if you want to get the rule.
I mean, purple? That's purple, almost looking pinkish like. We could definitely see that they were into some of the more finer things in the Imperium.
Rulers of Old Terra on side, then promising them their own extra fancy and glorious legion seems quite clever. And the third were from the very start used as an almost poster legion. While they were still experienced Astartes warriors, the third legion formed honor guards and diplomatic delegations, fought alongside the custodes clad in armor of gold.
Ah, there we go. So they were meant to be the poster boys. There's a distinction right there. They were meant to be the poster boys to represent, quote unquote, the best Terra has to offer. Ergo, they sought perfection.
Gold and imperial purple, and carried aloft the standards of the emperor into battle. Given that their Primarch also shared a lot of these preferences, it seems clear that this was the intention. While the third would be a capable legion, like any other, they seem to have been intended as the glorious public face of the Legion as Astartes. The one
among all, this is like the first time there was an actual distinction between the jobs of each and every one. Because like everyone in this particular table is combat centric. Do combat, fight, that's it. I mean, the blueberries act as some sort of a Swiss Army knife, but beyond that, meh. Their objective is still fighting, but it looks like we're looking. I mean, if this was regular army, we are looking at the model battalion whose job is to basically stand and parade, look good, be tall, be clean, represent the army. Yeah, there's a distinction right there.
Probably most often seen by allies or other imperial armies. They would, of course, suffer early in the Crusade from a gene seed blight that massively reduced their numbers, and this sense that they couldn't possibly keep up with the other legions, that they weren't able to fight in the war as effectively, would turn that refinement eventually into arrogance and jealousy. But that was all in the future, and very much because of something that happened during unification. At the start, it seems clear that the intention was for the Third Legion to be a public-facing, almost propagandized force. You could even call them the heralds of the Imperium.
I mean, a propagandized force. I wouldn't consider them that. More on that, you know, they were meant to be a model battalion. They were meant to go on parades and stuff like that. They're meant to basically guard an embassy.
If there wasn't already another legion claiming that role. The 17th Legion, those that would later become the Word Bearers, were quite similar in intention. A bit like the Ultramarines, the early recruits for the Legion were deliberately found within the children of those who had defied the Emperor, but their training emphasized the crimes of their forebears and their duty to wipe clean that stain. From the very inception of the Legion, the 17th were given a name, the Imperial Heralds, and this seems to have developed into a very definite focus. The warriors of the Legion were zealous and uncompromising, seeing battle as a tool rather than a glorious way of proving oneself, a tool to spread the wider beliefs of the Imperium. The 17th were dedicated to the imperial truth, the casting down of superstition and religion, and they developed whole detachments whose job it was to tear down the symbols of a defeated enemy's faith, to burn their books and destroy their temples. Though they were officially named the Imperial Heralds.
So you wouldn't consider them to be the model battalion or the parade people, but consider them to be more like the SS battalion, I guess. Spread terror and the word of the Emperor by force. Peace through strength, in a sense that if you don't shut up, you will see these guys. Alright, got it.
When they were founded, they unofficially became known as the Iconoclasts. And of course, we assume that's intentional because their Primarch was really similar, focused not on the glory of combat, but on war as a tool for spreading belief. The issue was that to Lorgar, born in a priesthood on Colchis, belief fundamentally meant religious faith, which wasn't exactly what the Emperor had in mind. Anyway, these two legions seem pretty clear. They're intended from the very start to be concerned with spreading the beliefs and the public image of the Imperium. One, the public face of the armies, glorious standard bearers for the Crusade, and the other, spreading and enforcing the belief in the imperial truth. And again, we can be pretty clear about that because both were given their jobs directly by the Emperor, at their inception, and their primarchs turned out to be pretty
What? They were meant to spread the honor and glory of the Emperor. Of course.
similar. Like the Night Lords, the apples here did not
Behold, these are the words of the Emperor. Listen or die.
fall far from the tree. The next ones here are another legion that were given a really specific role from the start. The 5th Legion were independent and somewhat set apart from the other legions, employed by the Emperor as outriders, pathfinders, and scouts, a vanguard force that located the enemies of Old Night and harried their outskirts until the main forces of the Emperor could catch up. And this was something they were assigned to once the Great Crusade started as well, split into 100 self-sufficient independent pioneer companies. They spread out in search of the lost strands of humanity, each developing its own unique culture and traditions alone in the void. Again, it seems pretty clear that scouting and exploration was the intent for them, and they spent the majority of the early and mid-Crusade operating like this until, of course, the discovery of their Primarch. Jagatai Khan also seems to have been something of a loner, always on the move, content to operate on the fringes by his own rules, but his upbringing had focused this towards the life of a horse nomad in a wider tribe, and so the disparate companies of the 5th were eventually united to some degree.
I mean, this was a better interpretation. He definitely looks better. Here we're looking at like old Genghis Khan.
Culture of Chagoris.
This looked like it was drawn by one of Genghis Khan's enemies, whereas this one was drawn by an imperial citizen, a loyal imperial citizen, whereas this one was drawn by an imperial rebel.
Imposed upon them as a way of fostering unity. But it seems pretty clear that their role in the armies of the Emperor from the very start was intended to be scouts, pioneers, and pathfinders. Not one united legion, maybe, but 100 separate scouting companies. Another specialist legion designed for a specific military purpose. And then the last one in this category sort of don't fit anywhere else. The 1,000 Sons.
Yeah.
The 15th Legion were not part of the Trefoil project, but they were created in quite a similar way a few years later. During a resurgence of warp storms that temporarily forced a halt in the early Crusade, the Emperor spent that time working on the 15th Legion, where he recruited individuals from across Terra according to extremely exacting criteria that no one else knew. So exacting were they that there were only 1,000 recruits to start. And the reason for that became apparent a few years later when it turned out that they had an extremely high incidence of psychic power, powers the small legion could use in battle, though some were so potent that they also led to high incidences of mutation, the dreaded flesh change that Blade.
Is that why he turned red? Because of his psychic ability and stuff? Can someone please put it down in the comments?
The early legion. That would of course all make sense when their Primarch Magnus was rediscovered. He was a terrifyingly powerful psyker and also the only other Primarch to have a confirmed role definitely assigned to him by the Emperor in a book. Malcador says that he was destined to sit on the Golden Throne. It seems pretty clear here that the 1,000 Sons were an experiment in making psychic Space Marines, but the fact that it didn't quite work, that the flesh...
No, it didn't. I mean, that mantle fell on another legion. Anyways...
change was still so common, suggests that the Emperor was maybe willing to risk quite a lot in their creation.
Yes, he was.
Like the Salamanders, I wonder if the purpose of the 15th was really just to create Magnus, and the legion that derived from him
more like an afterthought.
Had no clear role other than, I don't know, seeing what would happen. Anyway, the 1,000 Sons never really had any other clear job other than being the legion that specialise in psychic power, so I've put them in this column as a specialist. That gives us 4 specialists, all legions created with what seems to be a very specific military role in mind, even if the last one's a bit esoteric. And that brings us to the final category, the one that I have called insurance. We know from occasional mentions in the books that Malcador and the Emperor...
Interesting. So the rest would serve as insurance. Insurance as what? In case all of the rest would fail?
Predicted some sort of possible rebellion on the part of their Primarchs. Yeah. Maybe not on the scale of the Horus Heresy, maybe only after unity had been achieved, maybe only from 1 or 2 of them, but they always knew it was a possibility, and some legions seem to have been created as sureties against this. Now, what confuses all this slightly is that later some other legions would decide that that was their role too, so it's hard to say with any certainty what the intention was, but there were two legions who seem to have been given very deliberate roles by the Emperor very early on that fit.
We got it. Our role is to overthrow the Emperor. You know what?
Into this category. The first are easy to guess. The 20th Legion, the Alpha Legion, were the final part of our Trefoil, another legion created in total secrecy, and we know that while officially they were the last and smallest legion to be deployed, this was far from the truth. In reality, elements of the 20th have been operating covertly across the galaxy for decades before this as an almost ghost legion, specializing in infiltration, intelligence, and sabotage. Again, a role given to them from the very founding, and something deliberately kept a secret from the other legions and primarchs.
I wouldn't call them as insurance, more like an intelligence division.
In fact, if you believe Alfarius's own account, which I should point out might be a lie, he was the first found Primarch, and the Emperor deliberately kept that a secret from all the other Primarchs and the rest of the Imperial Court until near the end of the Great Crusade. And even if you don't believe that, the Alpha Legion hardly changed their operation when their Primarchs were found. The Primarchs and the existing Legion were extremely similar, which again suggests that this was the intention all along. The Alpha Legion were also quite happy to infiltrate other legions, spy on their actions, and generally seemed to behave more like an internal security division than a conquering army, one vastly larger than they officially were on paper. By paper, we of course mean that there were no records of them either. At the time,
isn't that the point of any intelligence division or in any intelligence department? They end up doing more than they were supposed to do. CIA, JFK, KGB, Stalin, anyways, FSB. They almost always end up doing more than they're supposed to do, and double-edged sword, I guess.
Explanation for this were that there was a gene seed flaw or some shortage of manpower, but of course, given their size and the heresy, it seems likely they were deliberately hidden. A weapon to be used only by the Emperor. I would suggest that the Alpha Legion are the hidden side of the insurance category, something the Emperor kept obscured in order to monitor and possibly counter any internal threats from other legions. But this will be balanced by a more outward-facing threat, and it's not the one people expect, but in this category, I'm putting the 12th Legion, then the Warhounds. The 12th were quite a prominent early legion, noted from the start for their hot-blooded and savage nature and their incredibly strict discipline that was required to keep them in line. They fought without mercy, tearing apart the enemy, heedless of risks, and they were training constantly, always ready for deployment at a moment's notice. But rather than be deployed to the front lines of the Crusade, the early 12th Legion, with their brutal phalanxes and savage way of fighting, were deliberately held back by the Emperor, kept very close to his side. No one knew the reason for that, but Imperial sources at the time suggest two theories. One was that they were used as a mobile reserve, a sort of shock assault force that could be deployed to specific confrontations to break sieges or speed up a compliance, and companies of the 12th were occasionally used.
Or if you think about it, this could be I mean, the reason why the Emperor kept this particular legion close to his chest is because he knows he did Angron bad, alright? He knows he did wrong, he didn't do right by Angron, and Angron knows it, and the Angron would turn traitor the first opportunity because of what was done to him. I mean, it's a perfectly valid theory that, you know what, you betrayed this particular son, you know you didn't do right by this particular son, and this son would basically, you know, stab you in the back the first time, so might as well keep your, you know, enemies close, stuff like that.
Used in that manner, and they were incredibly effective. But the second theory was that they were a threat. They were a weapon to be unleashed in case of disloyalty amongst the Emperor's own. The Emperor himself named them his warhounds, his most loyal attack dogs, to be kept by his side in case anyone stepped out of line. an open threat compared to the hidden hand of the 20th Legion. In fact, one of the fun developments of the Great Crusade was that as the Primarchs were found and reunited, the Warhounds, now renamed the World Eaters, and the Space Wolves of the 6th Legion effectively swapped jobs. Liman Rus and his legion took on this role as the Emperor's executioners, a bloody and savage force designed to keep the other legions in check, the most loyal to the Emperor, which was of course the exact way the Warhounds were seen and used by the Emperor early on. And the World Eaters became a savage horde of bloodthirsty butchers, which was how the early 6th Legion was seen and how they were used by the Emperor before the discovery of Rus. Angron himself isn't very useful. He doesn't provide us with much evidence either way.
Why would he be useful? Look at what they did to him. I wouldn't be useful to anyone apart from myself. In fact, the only use I would be for vengeance.
Since it's impossible to know what he would have been like without the nails, there's limited evidence, very limited, that he might have had some sort of empathic ability. But as we said at the start, magic powers are not always evidence of the Emperor's intention. At the start of the Crusade, it seems pretty clear that the 12th were another much more open form of insurance for the Emperor, in case anyone else defied him. And that leaves us with one legion left, who are possibly the hardest ones to categorize, the 1st Legion. And they're hard to categorize because the 1st Legion was shaped so much by its position for many years as the only legion. The 1st Legion were created and deployed long before any other, reaching tens of thousands of warriors, while the others were only a few hundred strong, and they fought heavily in the Unification Wars on Terra, where they became known as the Angels of Death. Far superior to any of the Emperor's other armies, they were deployed against only the most horrific of the Emperor's enemies, or split up and assigned to various of the armies of unity, brought to the forefront only when there was something too horrible for anyone else to deal with. They didn't build...
Well, technically, they were the only ones back then, so they were your go-to guys. So I wouldn't consider them to be quote-unquote the best or the go-to guys because they were the only ones there. Of course, they were. They'd come to you if you're the only. Like, it's like being the firstborn, right? Being the firstborn in any family, you're the first one there. So therefore, when something needs to be done, you're the favorite employee. In fact, you're the only employee, being that that's their situation.
They didn't claim territory. There were other soldiers for that. Their job was merely to kill things nobody else could. Now, in the glorious retelling of this story, the role of the 1st Legion was as hunters and exterminators of monsters. They were the only ones that could be trusted to kill anything, in the process testing and refining systems of organization and tactics that would eventually find their way into all the other legions. And there is some confirmation in this. When the Legion was sent out from Terra, it was years ahead of everyone else, and they were armed with the most horrific weapons still existing from Old Night. Horrific old technology, ancient ships already thousands of years old, and they were deployed into the darkness to face the most terrible alien threats, decades before anyone else left the solar system. The only ones that could be trusted to take out the worst enemies on their own, the Emperor's exterminators. But there's another way.
Again, Emperors, Hounds, Exterminators. Not much distinction from everyone else. It seems that it's Fulgrim and those other guys that actually has a distinctive job apart from the others.
To tell the same story, right? It's possible that the role of the 1st Legion was simply to be the prototypes. The early warriors of the Legion didn't seem to...
They're the first ones. They're like the only ones there. Ergo, favorite employee. You are now one of my elite employees. He's the only employee.
Have any genetic preferences traceable other than a slight fatalism that would become more apparent as they were eclipsed by all the other legions, and much of their sense of being the most trusted, the most loyal, the only ones who could deal with the threat came from basically being the only Astartes available at the time. There's no particular evidence that any other legion would have done it worse. Even their early deployment, armed with the ancient irreplaceable weapons of Old Night, could be explained simply by the fact that they were the first. As the military-industrial complex of Mars was ramping up for the Crusade, the ships and weapons available at the time would have been the oldest ones, the ones the Imperium couldn't make anymore. And that gives us two very conflicting answers for the Dark Angels. If you asked the Dark Angels, I'd suspect that they would consider themselves the most loyal, and we know that can't be genetically intended given what happened after, the most experienced, which is fair, and the only ones who could be trusted with the most horrific weapons, which puts them in battle line, but also specialists because of extermination, but also a sort of terror weapon, and also an insurance against all the less loyal legions. But you could also read this as them kind of having no role, or at least their role was to be the prototypes, used to test the ability of these new Adeptus.
Yeah, I mean, you are the prototype being the firstborn.
Astartes warriors. And when that job was done, and 19 other legions were placed into full production, all benefiting from what the first had learned, the first were given all the old weapons, all the ones that couldn't be replicated anymore, and sent out in the void to, I don't know, take out whatever aliens they could before they died. Either the ultimate weapon that hit every single category better than anyone else, or a prototype legion sent off into the void when their actual role was complete. So yeah, there we go. What I think the actual role was of each of the Astartes Legion, or at least what we can glean once we try and strip away all the unintentional stuff. The culture of the Primarch's homeworld and the martial customs that derive from it. Magic powers Primarchs seem to have without any clear evidence of if they were given them or not. Events that shaped the legions after they were created and changed their personality in some unintended way. If we strip away all that, and try and figure out what they were like right at the start, this, I think, is what we get. 7 legions of formal military based around Primarchs and Astartes who had a tendency towards practicality, stubbornness, and analytics. Assisted by 1 dedicated scouting legion of Pathfinders, they formed the main battle line of the Crusade. Then 4 legions of horrors based around punishment, cruelty, and bloodthirsty aggression to take out enemies who weren't worth an organized campaign. 2 legions to spread the beliefs, the propaganda.
I don't see the distinction between the terror and the insurance. I mean, you're both insuring yourself when you send each and every one of these things. They can fill the role, except of course, Fulgrim's model battalion. I mean, it seems that among all, only the model battalion has this distinct job of actually being being a representative, or being quote unquote diplomatic
of the Imperium, 1 hidden hand and 1 open hand as insurance against any of them going rogue, 1 experiment basically derived from the need for a psychic equal, and the initial prototypes that helped develop it all. It's not what the legions would turn into, it's not how we're used to seeing them all today, and it doesn't fit with the stories that they sometimes invent to make sense of themselves, to differentiate themselves from their peers. But it does make a lot of sense, and it lies within the realm of what's possible when creating the Primarchs, right? I think it's quite common.
I mean, shit went down after Olenor.
For people to misread exactly how much control the Emperor had over how...
Hold on, check out this picture, right? Was there something happening between these two in a sense that, you know, Horus was so jealous of the favors heaped upon Sanguinius? That's why he went nuts.
How the 20 legions would turn out. Just like Leman Russ, I think a lot of people assume that the way the legions ended up was the plan all along. But for a lot of the legions, there's no evidence for that. The Blood Angels, for example, developed into this role as a drop assault force descending from the heavens like vengeful angels. And so people assume that must have been their plan all along, their particular specialism in the great scheme. But there's no evidence that the original Blood Angels, the Revenant Ninth, particularly favoured jump packs at all. And the entire angel thing was because of Sanguinius's mutation, something that probably doesn't come from the Emperor. If Sanguinius hadn't had wings, or been treated as a deity by the tribes of Baal, the Blood Angels would have never really developed those tactics and would...
I mean, they could have just as easily shoved nails down up his head. But he was the pretty one. He was the early 2K Justin Bieber of the Legion, of the Emperor's children.
Have been something very different. Similarly, Rogel Dawn, the Emperor's Praetorian, master of fortification, didn't really do any of that on his homeworld of Imwit. He was more like a conquering warlord, Gilliman Light, seeking to unite near...
Gilliman Light! Oh my god! Wait, that means he's the replacement if something happens again to Gilliman.
by planets. The
Oh my god, Rogel is Gilliman Light.
fortification thing came from the Legion, developed from a particular quirk of their gene seed, and while, yeah, the Emperor did make that gene seed, there are probably more reliable ways if you want to end up with a fortification Legion than just making their gene seed really, really painful and hoping it all works out that way. With the exception of a couple of very specific ones who were created almost as an experiment to do a specific thing, I think the genius of the Emperor's design wasn't in carefully planning all of their roles, but more in giving the 20 different strains a range of different character traits and then sort of seeing how it all worked out. Any intention you see here is a lot more broad than is usually talked about and allows a lot of the legions to kind of find their place, making it so that some were more careful and some more forthright is much more believable than instilling within them a great love of sieges or motorbikes. There, I think that's as close as I'm going to get. The interesting thing here isn't necessarily that
the interesting thing here is that there's supposed to be 2 more.
This is perfectly accurate. It's how much every legion changed, how much they were different from what the Emperor intended. And you could read into that a lot. It certainly explains to some degree why the Emperor treated them like he did, why he seemed to have so little trust of them. Anyway, that was a very, very long thought
So he didn't trust his own children. Alright, explains a lot.
Experiment. Hopefully it's been interesting. Thanks for watching.
Alright, you guys, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, do the whole notification button thing to help us out with the algo. We'll see you around, alright? Bye! Oh, yeah, he's his merch.
And if you'd like to hear more about the lore of 40k, there's probably another video popping up there on the right. And of course, if you'd like to support the channel, you can like and subscribe, you can buy merch on the store, or you can become a member here or on Patreon and get early videos and access to some giveaways too. See ya!
Bye!